Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Weird Science, movie that eventually became a show. So, the thing that I gotta say about the idea of this movie is, I guess, if you can't fake it, then you make it. Because, of course, we have both Gary and we have both Wyatt, who are struggling with confidence to the point of them deciding that instead of trying to find a woman and be able to figure out how to woo that woman and then be able to get laid by that woman, they decide to go on and instead, if you can't find a woman to do all of that stuff, then how about instead you invent one? So, we have both Gary and we have both Wyatt that goes on to take a number of items, which of course would be a supercomputer, a Barbie that is attached to a couple wires, and bras over their heads to then somehow concoct the perfect woman that appears magically from behind them through a door that says, "Will break for women." So, which is kind of ironic. So, we have somehow Lisa, who eventually gets her name and appears right in front of these men, and is to go on and give both of these men the confidence that they eventually are to desperately need, to give them challenges that they end up conquering over, and are to go on and find the women that they've always wanted, to then eventually finally be themselves around these women, and then go on to have this happy ending at the end of all this, to where Lisa can go on and move on, and then find another guy or another couple of guys that will go on and be the next Gary and the next Wyatt. So, we have this to be like somewhat like a number of things. We can go on and say that this is fairly similar to the movie Bedazzled that was done by Harold Ramis. We can go on and say that this movie could be fairly similar to even like Lars and the Real Girl, where of course Lars eventually is to struggle to be around people, so he goes and buys a plastic one off the internet to eventually pretend that this plastic girl is to be a real woman, and that all the rest of the town has to go on and forcibly pretend that this woman is a real woman also, and they play around with that. So, there is also just a lot of other just interesting date movies that eventually, if you cannot go on and obtain the actual girlfriend, then you could probably buy one, and so on and so forth, like Can't Buy Me Love, or eventually movies like The Perfect Date, which is kind of a different kind of gender swapping thing, but like still, you get all those kinds of movies where eventually certain people are to really just need to be able to have a girlfriend and or boyfriend, and so eventually they end up somehow coming up with one within those kind of parameters. So, with that said, I know that that's like me going on and talking about this movie was very vague, and eventually once we go into spoilers I'll be more specific. But so, Weird Science is a really fun film. Go ahead and check it out if eventually you'll go on and rent this movie or be able to buy it, because it's actually a really good classic film and it's really fun. It also is a John Hughes movie, so if you guys have gone on and seen movies like 16 Candles or Breakfast Club and stuff like that, you've kind of liked those kind of movies, Weird Science may be another fun film for you. So, with that said, where can you go on and find this film for absolutely free without no possible fees of any kind, unless you want to go on and just avoid certain ads for certain apps? You can go on and find this movie besides on Fubo TV or whatever goofy app that is. You can go on and find a number of apps through a Google search, and here's one of them. See Movies app, letter C Movies app. So you can go on and be able to search for this app, hopefully be able to download it. Find that it's going through some updates right now, and you can download Yes Movies and be able to go on and eventually download all this stuff that I just mentioned, letter C Movies and all that stuff, to then go on and see this movie for absolutely free. The next app would be Fox HD Movies. The logo will say Fox HD Movies, but the title will say something different. It'll say Play 1080p HD Movies. And then the final one could be Google Play Store search. You can go and find an app called 123 Movies and hopefully be able to find Weird Science or be able to go on and find a number of other movies for absolutely free. It may vary, but at the end of the day, you can still say that you can see a number of movies for absolutely free, like Spider-Man, No Way Home, or a number of other stuff. So, you can also go on to a Google search and put in the words TV Crush. That eventually will lead you to an app that says HD Movies, 123 Movies. Be able to go on and find an app where the logo will say HD Movies, the king crown off to the side. Be able to download that, go on, and be able to find a number of movies for absolutely free. So, now let's go on and just go into spoilers about this movie. Yeah. So, let's go on into the spoiler part of Weird Science because it's very much a cult classic. It's a lot of fun. I enjoy it every time that I go on and watch it via either being on TV at some points randomly or going on and eventually just checking this out today because I wanted to go on and just see this movie again because it's really fun. And I don't remember every single thing about it, so I wanted to go on and just watch this movie because I think when I would go on and see this movie normally, I would kind of randomly catch it on TV somewhere. So I probably would have never have gone on and probably seen the whole entire thing, but I've seen most of it now. So, with that said, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about the time to spoil this movie. So, we go on into the very beginning of this film, and we have both Gary and Wyatt who are going into this gym class with a number of women. All of a sudden, both Gary and both Wyatt are to go on and think of all the possibilities that could go on to them talking to these women and possibly getting unclothed with these women and everything that leads after that. So, Gary and Wyatt are going on and talking about Deb and Hilly behind both Ian and Max's back. Of course, Ian and Max are to be both played by... Ian is to be played by Robert Downey Jr. and Max is to be played by Robert Russler. And so, Gary and Wyatt are to go on and continue to talk about these girls to the point where the guys behind them decide, because they don't like how they're talking, to basically pull down the shorts of these two guys to expose their underwear. And so we go on to have everyone in this gym class looking at both Gary and both Wyatt, and so they both pulled back up their shorts and excuse themselves from this class. So both Gary and Wyatt retreat off to go on to Wyatt's home where they both sit and watch a Frankenstein movie. And so while Gary is to look on as this mad scientist, this Victor Frankenstein, is to create his monster out of a dead corpse, we have Gary who is to look on at Wyatt's supercomputer and Gary's imagination. And so Gary is to go on and then tell Wyatt, it's like, well, hey, why can't we go on and create a woman? And Wyatt's like, no, like, I'm not going to go on and I'm not going to, like, unbury any corpses or go to a graveyard and unbury anybody. And Gary's like, no, that's not what I mean. Gary is to go on and want Wyatt with his supercomputer to just build a woman and play out all these certain scenarios and see what happens. Well, Wyatt and Gary go through this computer and start going on and putting body parts together, and at first they are to analyze what size of chest that they want this girl to have, meaning bust line. And so eventually Gary is to mention how, like, anything more than a handful is probably going to get yourself injured, so maybe they should just kind of go with like an average kind of size. So they go on and they start to try to put these pieces together, but Wyatt doesn't have enough software to complete this woman. It's not possible. So Gary is to want to push Wyatt to somehow make this possible. And so it seems that Wyatt is to go on as if this is Matthew Broderick and War Games and all kinds of stuff. And Wyatt is going on and hacking into the Pentagon, I guess. And all of a sudden, this guy is to all of a sudden wake up after sitting in this area for who knows how long. And all these bells and whistles and lights are going on. And he all of a sudden is to be scrambling to try and prevent Wyatt from hacking, I guess, into this 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 place, this location. And so eventually Wyatt is continue to hack his way into figuring out how to go on and be able to get more information into the supercomputer by presenting more pictures of certain women and going on and putting personality things in there like Einstein or David Lee Roth, and just going on and consistently putting things into this computer to eventually have them figure out that after Gary and Wyatt attached this Barbie doll with these wires to this computer, that eventually this girl eventually is to appear after breaking for women from this door, and Lisa is to become a real breathing woman. And so both Gary and both Wyatt, the very first thing that they are going to do with Lisa is going to go on and take them out, because I guess these guys don't rarely get out very much. So when Lisa is to drive both Gary and Wyatt to a location, Lisa is to go on and ask these guys what her name is, because she isn't named yet. And so Gary goes on and is to go and call Lisa Lisa, because it seems that at some point Gary was to have gone on and had a girlfriend named Lisa, who eventually ended up kicking him in the nuts. And so Gary, I guess, being sentimental from a previous love, was to go on and call this girl Lisa, and Lisa was completely fine with that. So We then go on and have the three of these people make their way to this bar called the Candy Bar. Here's one also thing that I need to mention also. We had both Gary and both Wyatt who are to share a shower with Lisa also before they make it to the bar. And eventually Lisa is to consistently look back at the two guys, and after she is to go on and leave this shower, we all of a sudden notice that both Gary and both Wyatt have both their jeans and sneakers still on while they're in the shower. And so we have Gary and we have both Wyatt who don't know what to expect for the night of being with Lisa. So they all of a sudden are wearing some kind of formal clothes, but then eventually once they leave their room, they realize that all of a sudden their clothes, their outfits have all of a sudden changed. And so they're both looking at one another and saying, "Oh my god, like, do you own these clothes? I don't know. Do you own these clothes? Are these yours? I don't know. Like, we're just wearing them now." But both of them realize they look great. So both of them go on to end up in the candy bar where it seems that they are kind of very unsure if they're going to fit into this bar. But then all of a sudden, a few drinks later, and all of a sudden they fit in like a glove. We, of course, have Gary, who's exchanging a story with all of these bar patrons, and Gary is to go on and mention that he had called this girl every single day, and the one time that he went on and hanged up on her, this girl went on and found him and kicked him in the nuts. Going on and giving us more of the story of what, of course, Wyatt and Gary was to have said before. So we go on and we have a guy like Dino who is to ask Lisa why, of course, that she is with both Gary and Wyatt. And he ends up calling them a certain name. And so Gary is to just go on and say, it's like, well, hey, she just likes that kind of guy. And Dino just starts laughing along with a number of these guys. And they just thoroughly enjoy both Gary and Wyatt. So all of a sudden we have Gary, who I guess has become so drunk that he ends up almost falling over. And so they realize that, okay, like, these guys have drank enough. They need to go on and go home for the day. So we have, of course, Wyatt, who is now driving home because Lisa is too tired to. And Wyatt is mentioning to Lisa that he should not be driving. And we, of course, have Gary that chimes in saying that, like, yeah, he doesn't even have his license, Lisa. And so, even though Lisa is to go on and give them fake IDs, that doesn't really matter much. So, we go home, and we all of a sudden have Chet that is to arrive to see both Gary and both Wyatt. And so, Chet, of course, is Wyatt's older brother. And so, consistently, when Chet finds Wyatt to be in some kind of trouble, Chet eventually wants to get bribed to be quiet. So we go on and we have both Gary and we have both Wyatt, who are very drunk, and Chet is to be able to smell this off of them. And so we, of course, have Chet, who is telling Wyatt that if Gary pukes, Wyatt's dead. So we go on and have Chet, who is telling Gary about things that would gross out Barry, like ashtrays and a number of other things, and greasy sandwiches that are to be dipped in ashtrays and all kinds of things. Chet is to go on and simulate as if he's barfing, and Gary is to go on and just touch the mouth of Chet and is to just start laughing at Chet, and Wyatt is telling Gary, or Wyatt is telling Chet that Gary is not laughing at him, and Gary immediately says that he is. So Gary and Wyatt go into the room, and so Wyatt eventually is to try to hope that Lisa is to still be somewhere where he can talk to her, and Lisa is all of a sudden right behind him. So Lisa and Wyatt go on to kiss one another, and Wyatt is to go on and talk about girls' gymnastics, and Lisa's like, well, like, I don't know if I can do anything like that, but, like, I'll give it the old college try. So, via the next day, we have Wyatt, who has his shoes where his head should be, and so we have Gary and we have Wyatt, who are immediately thinking that the night before everything was just some dream because it doesn't make sense. And Gary is telling Wyatt, it's like, well, it can't be a dream because both of us had it, so it doesn't make sense. So we have Wyatt who's just saying, no, like, it just has to be some dream. And so Wyatt is to convince Gary, or Gary is to tell Wyatt, it's like, well, hey, like, in your dream, did I go on and did I, like, barf? And Wyatt's like, no. And then Gary's like, well, maybe there's some difference there. So we go on and have them have the suspicion that maybe Lisa isn't real. So we go on and have Lisa, who is to already start to make breakfast, and Wyatt is to come down to get food, and he is wearing the exact same clothes that Lisa was to be wearing the night before. So Wyatt is to all of a sudden be wearing this low-cut top and these panties, and he's walking around, and all of a sudden Wyatt is desperately telling Lisa that Wyatt has gone on and had to pay Chet so much already that to try to keep this secret a secret, Wyatt doesn't want to go on and have to pay Chet any more money. So Lisa is to try to remain quiet. So all of a sudden we have Chet going on and making and stealing this breakfast that of course was made for Wyatt. And so all of a sudden when Wyatt starts walking around, Chet realizes that Wyatt's walking around in women's clothing, and so Wyatt is to say that, or Chet is to say that while Wyatt is walking around in this, and obviously women's clothing, that there is going to be a significant pay that Wyatt will have to go on and do to have Chet be quiet. So we of course have Chet, who is thinking to possibly have Wyatt's VCR and possibly maybe a number of other things. So Wyatt is going to pay Chet whatever he needs to pay him to keep him quiet. So we then go on after that and are to, of course, have Gary and Wyatt go on to the mall. So we end up having these guys go to the mall, and eventually what happens is that while Gary and Wyatt are to say that they seem to be very happy, all of a sudden we have both Ian, we have both Max that are noticing both Wyatt and both Gary kind of sitting next to one another. We have Max decide to drop this icy upon their heads, and they end up getting this huge slushy over their heads, which then eventually both the guys end up joking around about how uh, like it just kind of slipped or whatever. But the girls that, of course, are to be with both Ian and both Max know better, that these guys have gone on long enough and bullied them. So eventually, Deb and Hilly are starting to realize that these guys are just bullies, and maybe it's time to break up with them. To where all of a sudden, Ian and Max are to change their happy faces to then looking all frowny and like, oh, like we didn't mean it, like, oh, take us back. And all of a sudden, while the girls are just talking to one another, the guys are dancing around, just doing these goofy things, and they're like, oh no, I'm so sad, I'm so heartbroken about what we just did. Like, believe me, I'm realizing it now. And as the girls go back to talking to one another, they're just kind of goofing around. So all of a sudden, while Ian and Max are to eventually go through this mall, and at some point spot Lisa, both of them are to take a double take and realize that they need to go on and go up this escalator to then try and go on and talk to that girl more. And all of a sudden, that leads them to then follow Lisa to realize that both Gary and Wyatt are to have this girl, and they drive away with her. And so Lisa's to mention how there is a party at Wyatt's place, and eventually they can look them up in the directory to find that these guys are going to have a party, and that to tell everybody they know that there's a party at Wyatt's place. So eventually we go on to have both Gary and Wyatt who have this party, and everything ends up like having this whole room where there is this big massive table, has a bunch of food there. So we go on and have, of course, the grandparents of Wyatt who decide they want to drop in on this party. And when they try to eventually go into this party, it seems that Lisa is to cut them off, and she then leaves them frozen in one of these cupboards and just lets them stay there to where they are to not even age or not even move. So we go on into this party, and we have both Gary and both Wyatt who are to stay in this bathroom the whole time. And we get to a point where both Deb and both Hilly are to make their way into this bathroom and want to go on and eventually fix their faces. And Gary is telling Deb, it's like, well, why do you need to fix your face? What's wrong with your face? There's nothing wrong with it. And Wyatt is to mention that Gary was to take a huge, and that's the reason why they were in the bathroom for so long, and that's why they're lighting this match. But Gary goes on and slaps Wyatt and is to be upset with him. So we go on and have both Gary and both Wyatt who go into this shower to eventually have this little huddle where they're planning what they're going to do next. And while they're talking, at some points they're just kind of saying and mumbling these things. So by the time both Gary and Wyatt are to have this game plan and are wanting to go on and talk to both Deb and Hilly again, all of a sudden it seems that the girls that are in the bathroom now are different girls than both Deb and Hilly. And so these guys realize that they're going to have to now go into the party to then talk to these women. So eventually, we go on into this party, and Ian and Max are to go on and find Gary and Wyatt. And of course, they want dibs on Lisa, and they're, of course, going to go on and have Ian mention that he's going to go and kill the girls while Max goes on and obtains Lisa. So eventually, when Ian and Max are to find out that Lisa is to technically be owned by Gary and Wyatt, Ian and Max go on and talk to Gary and Wyatt about Lisa, and they go on and instead try to invent a girl for Ian and Max, which eventually ends in them going on, and instead of actually inventing a girl, all of a sudden a certain missile is to appear upon this house and crash through all the floors of it, because of course they forgot to attach a doll to these wires like they had done before. And so now there is a magazine with a missile on it, and so the wires end up just taking the picture of the missile and creating a missile through the house. So we have Lisa that is kind of upset with both Gary and Wyatt for doing what they did. And so we also had this house that starts to eventually do some goofy things by completely painting an entire room blue, and also going on and having a number of things just flying out of this chimney like it's being sucked out of it. And so we even have a girl who is playing on this piano that all of a sudden starts to get sucked into this chimney, and she ends up going flying out of it to fall into this pond, and she ends up just going on and swimming off. So we have so much chaos going through this house. But not only that, now Lisa wants to go on and put together some challenge to give both Gary and both Wyatt their confidence. So Lisa decides to go on and create a number of mutant bikers led by Lord General to go on and wreak havoc through this house. So we, of course, go on and have one of the mutant bikers who tear both Gary and both Wyatt through this closet that they're in to eventually show themselves. And so we start to see that the mutant bikers are grabbing onto Deb and Hilly. And so eventually both Gary and Wyatt realize that they need to go on and do something, that they need to kick some butt. And so we then have, of course, Gary, and we have both Wyatt, who are starting to go and mouth off to these mutant bikers and to tell them it's like, well, hey, you can either leave or you can stay here and die. And eventually we have Gary who is to throw this gun into the Lord General's face. Now I have to go on and explain this gun. So, we had both Gary and we had both Lisa, and Lisa is meeting with Gary's parents. And so Lisa is to mention to Gary's parents that Gary's going to go to a party where there's sex, drugs, and rock and roll, all kinds of crazy stuff. And immediately his parents disagree to Gary going to this party, and we had Gary who was trying to come up with some kind of something to say that this party isn't as what Lisa was trying to say it is. So Gary goes on to try and convince his parents that it's just some movie party or something like that. So Lisa is to try to say the opposite, and so of course Gary's father is telling Gary that he's not going to this party over his dead body, and eventually what happens is Lisa is to be able to use her magical ability to eventually have Gary's parents forget about Gary, to the point where Gary's mother is to ask Gary's father that like Gary was asking or was acting kind of peculiar earlier on, and Gary's father is to say to Gary's mother, it's like, who are you talking about Gary? Who's this Gary? And the more and more within this movie, we have Gary's mother saying that this is your son, Gary, and Gary's dad is to say, like, I don't know who you're talking about, to the point to where by the end of this movie, we have Gary who drives away, and Gary's mother is to say, there, that was Gary, and Gary's father again is just like, I don't know who you're talking about. So, anyways, so we go on and we had Lisa, the way of which that she was to convince Gary's father to have Gary go to this party was to pull a gun on him, and eventually that same gun is to be used by Gary to threaten these mutant bikers. So eventually we have Gary who's talking to Lisa about this gun that Lisa pulled out, and Lisa is to mention that this gun is just a squirt gun. And so when Gary is to go on and point this gun at these guys, he doesn't fire a single bullet, but he assumes that it's just a squirt gun. So when Gary is to start be waving this gun around, everyone is to freak out. But then Gary's like, no, it's just a squirt gun. And then he fires off a round, and it's legitimate bullets. And both Gary and Wallace are Wyatt are to freak out that it's like, oh my god, this was a real gun. So the mutant bikers decide to leave, and eventually we have one of the mutant bikers who says, like, hey, like, could you go on and just keep this between us? Like, I'd hate to lose my teaching job. And all these guys are to go on and talk about doing lunch, and that these guys are all well and good, and we have the one girl who's to be led by General or Lord General, that she loves the decor in this house and all this stuff. So all these mutant bikers are all like not as tough as they seem. So we have these bikers who go on and leave, and then it seems that immediately Deb and Hilly are won over by Gary and Wyatt, who are to go on and save the day. So eventually it seems that both Gary and Wyatt separate from one another to be with Deb and Hilly. And so we go on and have Deb and Gary going on and talking about how Lisa is like the perfect woman, and Gary has this perfect line of like, well, yeah, like Lisa like was to be the girl that I put together before I even knew what I wanted, and so now that I know what I want, like I wish that I could go back and just basically recreate this woman, make her look like you. And it's like, oh, that's nice. Oh, that's sweet. And we also have Wyatt that is going on and talking to Hilly and talking about how brave they were and how they rescued how they rescued everybody and how they pulled all of this off and so on and so forth. So eventually we also had Lisa that was to tell the girls to definitely go on and shower with them. It's exhilarating. And so the girls are like, oh my god, like they showered with Lisa? That's crazy. That's wild. So by the end of this, we have both Gary and we have both Wyatt who are to drive these girls home. And we, of course, have Gary not even realizing the miles per hour. And all of a sudden, he's realizing that he's going to get a huge number of tickets. But it seems that Gary somehow outsmarts these police by driving through this railroad track to where the police cannot follow. So we go on and we have Gary that eventually is to have this girl make her way home. So we also, before the girls absolutely get home, also I want to cover the Chet stuff. So Chet comes home the very next day to realize that his house is in shambles and looks awful. And so Chet goes on and is to say, it's like, well, if his room is perfectly okay, then he won't kill Wyatt. So Chet all of a sudden goes into his room and is realizing that his room is snowing. And so Chet is to be even more upset. So Chet goes on is to have his shotgun and just be banging on both Gary and Gary's girlfriend's Deb's head. So when Gary is to consistently try to be making a joke, we have Chet who continues to just bang his head with this shotgun at the end of it. So Chet wants to go on and talk to Gary and Wyatt about what had all happened, and Chet again is to go to the same well of like, hey, you're gonna go on and need to bribe me somehow, and like this is gonna be some substantial bribery. As we also have Chet who realizes that his grandparents are frozen within this cupboard, and Chet's just coming up with astronomical ways to have Wyatt bribe him. So finally Lisa is to step in and say like no more, like this is enough. And so finally Lisa is to tell the guys to go on and drive their girls home while Lisa is to deal with Chet herself. So we go on and we have Lisa who is to talk to Chet, and Lisa no longer wants Chet to go on and do what he's doing to Wyatt anymore and treat him like a real brother and so on and so forth. And Chet is like, well, what are you going to do about it? And Lisa's like, well, like, I can go on and do like the worst imaginable. And Chet, of course, is to go on and say, give me your best shot. So Lisa goes on and turns Chet into what would be described as a human toad like character, like creature. And so all of a sudden, we have Lisa who is now talking to this toad looking monster, which is kind of funny. And so Chet, now realizing how horrible his life can now be permanently, we have Chet who is now to give in to Lisa's demands. And so Chet is to now ask Lisa how long before he turns back to normal, and Lisa is to say in a number of hours or whatever that he'll come back to normal. So we go on and we have Chet when Wyatt and Gary come back to the house. We have Chet who is to go on and tell his brother that he loves him and that he won't do the stuff that he did before, yada yada yada. So eventually now Lisa is to decide to go on and eventually leave the boys because there's not much that she can go on and help them with anymore. So eventually what happens after this is everything that had happened from the party is to go on and be reversed. The missile that was to appear is to now disappear. All of the stuff that had fallen from the outside of the house is to now be sucked back into the house. And eventually everything is to go back to back to normal if it wasn't before, to then go on and eventually have this house look as clean as it was previously. So we then go on and have Wyatt's parents that appear and are to go on and be convinced that while they were gone, probably Wyatt was to probably throw this party, which wasn't really the case. So eventually both Wyatt and Gary were to realize like how much fun that they had and how much they now have girlfriends and how a lot that really means. Chet is to seemingly be back to normal for Chet, and we then go by the end of this and have Lisa, who is to just go into this gym class and move on to another group of men where she is to shape up in her own image and is to be wearing this skimpy outfit to end the film. So, with that said, that does technically wrap up the movie. Let me know in the comments below if there's something that I forgot, because I'm sure that there is. I'm sure there's probably just little details or something that I probably did forget about, or there's probably a whole entire scene that I probably forgot about, because that what usually happens within these kind of reviews, that I just kind of blank out about something or I forget some little scene, or eventually somebody has some funny joke or some funny line that eventually I did not say within this film, because there are a plethora of whatever of them. So let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite quote from this film? Because of course there might be one of them. We also had the moment where Chet was to go on and use his tongue to grab one of these bugs and eat it. Having Chet realize that now he is to go on and eat insects, and he can't imagine that he went on and did something like that, but he did. So, with that said, I think that does cover most of this movie. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about Weird Science, if you went on and also saw the show, and so on and so forth. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.